Good morning. On behalf of the Department of Romance, Languages, and Literatures at Harvard, in collaboration with the Consulate General of Boston, the Minda de Gunsberg Center for European Studies, and the France and the World Seminar at the Mahindra Humanities Center, welcome to you all. I am Christy Mcdonald, a research professor in Romance, Languages, and Literatures and Comparative Literature. This conference was meant to happen last March and was canceled, as were so many things, because of the pandemic. But here we are now, virtually. First, I want to thank a few people for making this webinar possible. Mike Holmes and the Bacon Funds from RLL, Kathy Coviello and Jamu White for their dedicated and unwavering help in organizing this event, and Chris Coyate, who has made the IT magic of the webinar happen. Many thanks to you all. We are celebrating the 2 volumes of Femmes et Littérature, Une Histoire Culturelle, which explores the continuity of women's writing in France and Francophone countries from the Middle Ages to today. It constitutes the first study of its kind in breadth and in depth, written by French and American scholars. And we are privileged to have with us today the editor of the whole project, Martine Reed, and 2 distinguished contributors to the volumes, Jacqueline Tule and Alison Rice, as well as 2 of the students who were part of my research team for the 18th century section, about which more a little later in the conference. Here is how the conference will unfold. Panel 1 will go from 10 to 11, and panel 2 will go from 11 to noon with a Q&A. And now I'll talk just very quickly about the guidelines for the webinar. The conference is being recorded. It will be conducted in English, except for the Q&A. You are welcome to ask questions in French or English. You can use the Q&A function to ask questions at any time during any of the talks. I already said you can speak in either French or English. The people may respond in either French or English. And the chat will be open for the last 15 minutes for comments. It's now my honor and great pleasure to introduce to you Arnold Montre, the Consul General of France in Boston. Arnold Montre is an alumnus of the École Normale Supérieure, the École Nationale d'Administration, Sciences Po, and the University of Paris too. He's a career diplomat, previously posted in Moscow and in New Delhi. And we are very lucky to have him here with us now in Boston. Arnold.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, dear Professor McDonald, dear Christy, dear members of the academic community, and allow me a special shout out for my fellow citizens from the Sorbonne and the great University of Lille who are with us today. And also to the French academic community here at Harvard. We know that there are more than 40 French citizens who are part of the faculty members, and so it's a great motive of pride. Dear friends, what an honor to be with you and open this wonderful discussion about women writers on this very symbolic day, opening the Mois de la Francophonie in New England. We'll have more than 30 events over March to celebrate Francophonie, which is a very important aspect of New England's history. And also, as we are preparing ourselves to celebrate International Women's Day 2021. Let me first congratulate all the authors of the 2-volume publication of Femmes et Littérature, Une Histoire Culturelle, and the editor, Martine Reed. Thank you so much for this wonderful work, a milestone in French studies, casting a new light on our best writers, from Louise Labbé to Madame de Lafayette, La Marquise de Sévigné, and so many contemporary writers. As many of you know, Gallimard is one of the most prestigious book publishers, so it's no surprise that they opened their collection to this wonderful Franco-American team back in 2020. Dear Professor Mcdonald, you very kindly had me shipped a copy of these two books, and reading them made me realize that some of my favorite writers in French literature are actually women. Marguerite Yourcenar, who ended her life not so far from here, Nathalie Sarraute, Marguerite Duras, and let's include also some American writers such as Edith Wharton, who loved French so much, though I don't think she wrote in French. Retrospectively, I also realized how appropriate it was back in 2019 to include a discussion between Claire Massoud and Leila Slimani for the very first edition of the Day of France at Harvard, an event that we launched, and a few weeks ago we had the second edition. I say retrospectively because this was not the intent. We reached out to Leila Slimani as one of the best contemporary authors and a great voice within Francophonie, who also shows how diverse and how dynamic literature is within the Francophone world. And more generally speaking, we continue in France to prefer referring to authors as individuals, as extraordinary individuals, paying little heed to their social and economic backgrounds or their sex. It's also a way to avoid your external considerations to interfere with the artistic experience of reading a book. And yet, reading these two volumes, how striking it is to see how socioeconomic conditions interfere with the number of female writers recognized and praised over the centuries. Let's think of all the talent wasted with these female writers who did not meet the appropriate conditions or appropriate recognition of their work. As an example, let me underline the extraordinary work made by Suzanne Suleiman on Irene Nemirovsky here at Harvard to show, to give to Irene Nemirovsky place she deserves in French literature. This is only an example of the list of writers to be discovered. And it's a long, inspiring work ahead of us to see over the centuries all those writers that did not get the full recognition they deserve. So thank you so much for the Center of European Studies and for the Department of Roman Languages here at Harvard for all the extraordinary work you do to promote French literature and discover new aspects of it. It's a real pleasure to participate in this discussion. And so thank you again, and I'm looking forward to the various speakers and their intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monsieur le Consul, for this very generous introduction. I am Sylvaine Guyot. I am professor of French literature and performing arts here at Harvard in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures. And I am also with Verena Conley and Annabelle Kim, the co-chair of the France and the World seminar at the Harvard Mahindra Humanities Center, a seminar that was founded and richly developed by Christy Mcdonald, along with Suzanne Suleiman. So I cannot but begin by echoing what Monsieur Arnold Montre has just said, and to highlight the critical magnitude of the historical revision offered by this collection of essays directed by Martin Reed. The title is telling. The intervention of Femmes et Littérature is precisely to place women on the front of the stage, and it fills a long-standing gaping hole in literary history, especially in France. It offers the first global and trans-historical synthesis on the littérature de femmes, not only by identifying a large and fascinating spectrum of as yet understudied corpus of texts and genre written by women, but also by replacing their production and contribution to the cultural field within the multi-layered socio-political context of each period. And by doing so, this collection addresses multiple burning questions, including the historicity, that is the historical, mutable nature of both the gender-based definition of identity and of the notion of literature itself and its canon. I thus want to thank very warmly the extraordinary team of 10 writers for the real arrow as shown on the cover of both volumes, the arrow, la flèche, that they throw into the field of literary criticism. And as Martin Reed puts it in a preface to the first volume, I quote, "Il est temps que la critique et l'histoire littéraire, abandonnant ignorance et préjugés, acceptent ce radical changement d'optique, change of optics, et poussent à son terme cette révolution herméneutique. Il en va de leur justesse, de leur crédibilité, de leur légitimité." So I am more than happy to introduce the first three speakers of our panel this morning. So our first intervenant will be Martine Reed. She is professor of French literature at the University of Lille. She's been working extensively on female writers in the 18th and 19th centuries, and she's the author of several books, including a biography of Georges Sand in 2013 that has been translated into English and Chinese. She edited dozens of critical editions of 19th century novels and essays from Stendhal to Daudet, founded the collection Femmes de Lettres with Gallimard, dedicated to women writers' fiction, and she directed numerous collective volumes on 19th century literature and literary history. And she is the general editor of this 2-volume collection of essays. Then we'll have Jacqueline Tule, who is professor emerita at Sorbonne University. She specializes in 14th and 15th century French literature, especially Guillaume de Machaut, Christine de Pizan, and François Villon. She's been visiting professor at a number of institutions in the US, including Princeton, Johns Hopkins, Berkeley, UPenn, and Dartmouth. Her books include The Color of Melancholy and A New History of Medieval French Literature. Her edition and translation of Les Œuvres Complètes de François Villon was published with the famous Bibliothèque de la Pléiade in 2014. In 2019, she published an edition and translation of 100 ballades d'amants et de dames by Christine de Pizan. And in 2020, a paperback edition of the complete works by Villon, both with Gallimard. Finally, we'll have the pleasure to listen to Alison Rice. Alison is Dr. William M. Skoll Associate Professor of French and Francophone Studies and Chair of the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures at the University of Notre Dame. Her first book, entitled Time Signatures, Contextualizing Contemporary Francophone Autobiographical Writing from the Maghreb, that came out with Lexington Books in 2006, focuses on Hélène Cixous, Asia Djebar, and Abdel Kebir Khatibi. Her second book, Polygraphie, Francophone Women Writing Algeria, published by University of Virginia Press in 2012, examines the work of 7 prominent women writers from Algeria. And her third monograph, Worldwide Women Writers in Paris, Francophone Metronomes, forthcoming from Oxford University Press, is complemented by a series of filmed interviews available online. So this is my great pleasure now to leave the floor, so to speak, to leave the screen to Martin Reed.
Thank you. First of all, many thanks to Christy Mcdonald for having made possible this encounter. And of course, je remercie le consul de France de nous faire le plaisir d'assister à cette réunion. As the editor of the 2 volumes and a specialist of 19th century, I'll make a few preliminary remarks concerning the multiple ambitions of the work we have written together. We, French and American specialists of French and Francophone literature. I want to underline the presence in our project of these colleagues. It has been a way for me to recall how much the research accomplished in the United States has been founding, seminal, essential to be taken into account. Among other works, one can remember the special issue of the Yale French Studies in 1989, 40 years ago, The Politics of Tradition, directed by Jean Dujean and Nancy K. Miller, the collective enterprise, directed by Sonia Stephens, History of Women's Writing in France in 2000, the anthology due to Vicky Mistako, Les femmes et la tradition littéraire in 2005, without forgetting a somewhat ancient but quite precious book directed by Eva Martin Sartori in 1990, The Feminist Encyclopedia of French Literature. These texts have not only opened a new path in the way of understanding French literature and literature in French, they have documented solidly the woman's presence in the field. They have also identified the most important questions, difficulties, even sometimes aporias, related to such a topic. The framework was perfectly in place from the 90s on, if not before. But quite evidently, what has been thought and achieved in the United States could hardly have been done in France, for many reasons we can't cease to question. Reason of what could be called different intellectual tempo, reasons of culture, and many particular elements included in this term. Now, what did we try to do? Following many other existing research, mostly in English, but also, of course, partly in French too, we worked on identifying more systematically the many women's contributions to literature from the 12th century and on, detailing their specificities. We recall the success some of them encountered in their time, but mostly the considerable difficulties they faced as women writers in France and in the Francophone countries when they wrote and published, when their works were acknowledged by the critic, when they tried to participate in the literary institution and their ways of legitimation, and finally, when their works joined the official narrative of the literary past. We placed a considerable number of works in their context, being intended that in no way women's works could be confused one with another, considered together, let between them, and reduced to the only measure of their sexual identity, and this, of course, goes without saying. Our approach has been structured by a methodological eclectism we acknowledged. We used multiple tools. We used them diversely according to the period we considered. History in all its aspects, history of manuscripts, book and edition, history of ideas, literary history, history of morals and behavior, women and men history, sociology of literature, philosophy and anthropology among them, among several others. Our history is naturally backed by feminist and gender questions. If we wished to establish a solid état des lieux of women's presence in literature we have articulated it with a continuous reflection on sex difference and its specific operation to the literary field, on the consequences of what the anthropologist Françoise Héritier has called the differential valence of the sexes, noticeable everywhere at every period of time, and this couldn't be stressed enough. We all know that this valence has imposed hierarchies, decided on distinctive characters and exclusive roles. Critical Receptions offers an excellent measure of it within the different forms and discourses it adopted along the centuries. In every occasion, it reveals its extreme partiality before the constitution at the end of the 19th century of a national literary history, which deliberately passed over most of the women's accomplishments and downplay their importance. Today, most of the narrative about the literary past in France continue to ignore the exact shape of women's participation in the literary production. More or less explicitly, they continue to refuse the sexual dimension of an otherwise extremely valorized artistic domain of production, occupying a prestigious place in the common culture patrimoine. In the name of universalism, the resistance are still everywhere. The keeping of hierarchical views concerning the authors and their works is obvious, as well as the power of a conservative discourse, which still today recalls without hesitation politics of great writers dating from the 19th century. The efficiency of this politics presents at all levels of teaching of literature its distribution into the general public work to tighten the mesh of the classic literary field. In its bounds seem to be on one side Montaigne, on the other side Proust. It shows little interest for diversity and is generally limited to French literature. Just a minute. We know that during centuries, women's access to literature has been complicated for many reasons. The two most obvious are education, of course, and all sorts of discourses preventing them to publish, inviting them to keep silent, and blaming them when they had not to do so. Working on the 19th century, I have been amazed several times, again and again, by the violence of the attacks against women's works. And I think we should stop to consider it as a natural escort to literary criticism, which is still often the case in France. One should hear the specific violence at stake in literature, should think it, try to understand its roots, its ways of legitimation, if not its valorization. The growing visibility of women in literature, and more largely in the domain of the print, can explain these numerous forms of hostility. Critics have recalled it regularly. Such a situation is not enough, though, to explain the persistence of all these attacks. When one reads the 19th century criticism, one gets the impression that men conceive their presence in literature as a form of occupation in the military sense of the term, as a space to be delimited, inhabited, and kept for oneself. The rhetoric of attacking, defending, and excluding, of battles and victories, with determination and satisfaction of murderous formulas, it supposes, from the one who uses it, testifies the very conception of what it means to be in literature, a phantasmatically violent and warlike activity for a good number of writers who dream of it, live it, and practice it. Literary history reproduced this imaginary dimension of literature when Lanson, for instance, after many others, imagined battles, bataille d'Hernani, bataille réaliste. And I would invite to hear all these metaphors of war and violence literally. The questions of knowing if positions of that sort, formulated in these terms, do not denature women writers which claim them, and what they are supposed to incarnate since always, sweetness, generosity, care, will be debated throughout the century, the 19th century, by a certain number of feminists and women writers. Is one entitled or not to use the same metaphorical network, the same warlike imagination? This appears to be a central question in order to decide on the nature of all stands, on the way the feminine literature is taught and practiced, on the language to be used. And interestingly enough, feminists of the second part of the 20th century will pay special attention to this point. In conclusion, I'll insist on the fact that in no way our work has been conceived as something closed on itself, folded over some hypothetical feminine or national identity. On the contrary, it wanted to be as heterogeneous, open, global as possible, necessarily incomplete and transient. So many things are still unknown. So much work and reading remains to do. In other terms, our publication has been conceived not as an appendix or a simple complement of facts and figures, but as a part of a whole still to be written. From our point of view, what we have done puts in light on, nourishes and nuances the very way literature is produced and received. For that reason, our work should be viewed as an essential milestone towards the new history of literature in French. We will integrate the sexual difference with all its consequences. We therefore invite to a serious optical change, as the person who presented me just made this quotation. We hope that it would create some hermeneutical change. It should revisit old evidences, use gender as an essential tool to rethink all the existing categories and ways of interpreting literature. It will then constitute a story of the literary past and present in French, where every woman and man will find his or her place in a well-intended equality. Thank you.
Thank you, Martine. So Jacqueline, it's going to be your turn now.
Thank you, Christy, for organizing this meeting. Thank you, Sylvain, for your presentation, and Martine for the idea of these two volumes. It's a pleasure for me to speak of women writers, female women writers in French in the Middle Ages. Why would a woman have the desire to write in the Middle Ages? A desire that is said in the old language, talent. Would she have this desire? How could she realize it? When her male entourage does not see the needs to teach her to read nor write unless one wants her to become a nun. The idealized woman is sung by medieval poets and novelists under the banner of arms and love. She is condemned under the figure of Eve by moralists or exalted under the guise of Mary. She is matter of poetry, object of debate. How can she become a subject? It is the action of women in the literary field that I studied. What we call literature is not yet said with this term at the time. What interests me is not the representation of women in literature, but their agency. They can either write or play a role in the production of literature through commissioning, for example, or through an activity such as copying. She can also intervene in the reception of literature through reading. This relationship to letters is essentially through the medium of the vernacular language, French, in all the variety it offers in the Middle Ages. In other words, it is the arrival on the literary scene of the illiterate that is the subject of my investigation, since this is how the medieval cleric thinks of someone who does not know Latin, illiterate. If I also mention women who write in Latin, it is for a general understanding of the place of women in the field of literature, but my emphasis is on writing in French, which touches new circle. I have organized my study along two lines: an inventory and analysis of texts written by women from the 12th to the 15th century, a chronological survey then, framed by two chapters studying the sponsors on one part, the mecenas, and the readers on the other. The second axis is transversal and consists in weighing the preconceived ideas about women writers in the light of the results of the first part: genre, practice or not, subject treated, image used. And here we have some surprises. First, my first point, denial and paradox. An assertion is repeated over and over again: there are no women writing in the Middle Ages, or there are few of them. That is true, but above all, how do we avoid seeing them? Any field, historian, literary critics, or any critical or theoretical tendencies combined, join hands. I cite a few examples: the Comtesse Hardy, Marie de France, and Hurley, if they existed, or again, always about the Comtesse Hardy, and as long as she is not a literary fiction like Louise Labbé. My first quote comes from an historian in 2007, the second one from a Lacanian critic in 2019. In other words, the woman who writes is a man. We look for the man's hand behind the writing woman's. Christine de Pizan has faced this accusation in her own time and denounced it. Ils disent que des religieux te les écrivent, tes écrits. This denial is accompanied by the following paradox over the ages. The documented women one meet are replaced by invented women. There are more in the taste of the critics who reads, more in keeping with the expectation of what a woman can or should write. The case of Clotilde de Surville, bent over a cradle, an invention in the early 19th century to the detriment of Christine de Pizan, is exemplary. In the anthology published in 1824, Les poètes français depuis le XIIe siècle jusqu'à Malherbe, much more pages are devoted to Clotilde than to Christine. 30 pages to the fake medieval woman writer against 11 pages to the real medieval woman. Women founders of literary institutions are also invented when they are little or not represented in them. This is what Jean de Notre-Dame, the brother of the astrologer Nostradamus, did in the 16th century when he launched Clément Cisor as a restorer of floral games in Toulouse. This is the woman décor de salon, si je peux me permettre. Behind the denial is the unease in the designation of the woman who write, especially for the critics of the early 20th century. The feminization of professional names did not pose a problem in the Middle Ages, but it does pose a problem in contemporary times. One critic, Georges Doutrepont, in 1909, uses the passage through English to smooth out this difficulty. He speaks of the authoress, Christine de Pizan. Pierre Champion, for his part, resort to the designation by marital status, a surprisingly anachronistic use on the part of a chartist, Miss Christine de Pizan or Mrs. Christine de Pizan, with the addition of the abbreviated spelling of this title, which I personally read as mockery. This attitude is a sign of embarrassment in front of a phenomenon that a critic does not know how to apprehend. Finally, the role of the writer is undermined in one way or another by statements such as what women write appeals above all to women. It is a way to limit their audience, their influence. This undermining was already present in the Middle Ages. It is the one Denis Pyrasmus, his contemporary, had against Marie de France. Women's writing must be confined, kept in the margin. What transgression must a woman have to operate to write in the Middle Ages? What difficulties had she to cope with? Her condition is thought as will by God and seen as second, dependent, man's famous rib, côte de l'homme pour être à ses côtés. It is summed up by the proverb, weeping, speaking, spinning, put God in woman. God did not put a pen in the woman's hand, but the distaff. Hence the injunction that can be heard from religious, such as that of Étienne de la Miséricorde, un cistercien, in 1207, to Esclarmont de Foix, who wanted to take part in a theological debate on the Cathar position, go and spin your distaff. The consequence of this necessary transgression for a woman is that the learned woman is considered to be an unnatural woman in the strongest sense, that is to say, a scandal. This is how the figure of the witch is constituted. The woman who knows is always, whatever the nature of her knowledge, a witch. I was struck that the distorted name of Héloïse, Abelard's lover, is the one given to the witch of the castle of Nigromance, the castle of black magic, in Le Morte d'Arthur de Malory. Aloïs, a phonetic transcription of the name Héloïse. What surprise did I encounter? First, the question of genre. Women are not literary genre. Women are not confined to one genre, the letter of the Treaty of Education. However, we do not meet women in the Middle Ages who wrote romans, novels, even though the genre roman existed as early as the 12th century, as can be seen with Chrétien de Troyes. One can wonder about the reason of the phenomenon, which are diverse. Does the novel refer too much to a literature of entertainment, which is the thinking of the religious, who call them novels of the vanity, romans de vanité? Are they too long to write, and the woman has no time? Marie de France wrote des laits, short text, Christine de Pisan, in the non-didactic field of her work, des dits. Second question, that of topics. Does the woman only talk about love? No, and especially not of the so-called courteous love, which is a man's invention. When a woman speaks of love, she speaks of desire, like the troubadour woman, or she speaks of the prohibition linked to love and their transgression, like Marie de France in her lay, or she indulges in a criticism of courteous love, like Christine de Pisan, who praises in opposition, as far as she is concerned, happy marriage. And this too is a scandal. But the woman can talk about any other subject, especially history, philosophy and politics, and practice polemical writing. We see this in the case of the woman of Occitania at the time of the Albigensian Crusade. We verified it with Christine de Pisan, who launches the quarrel around the Roman de la Rose, which was to become La Querelle des Femmes through the ages. A woman attacks a cleric, the most famous, the most revered, Jean de Meaux. Finally, I did examine the question, what is writing as a woman? One can follow, especially in Christine de Pisan's work, a gendered coloring of the images. The two great networks of comparison of the writer's works are rethought, that of writing as ploughing and sowing, and that of the forge. In the first, the emphasis in woman writing is placed less on the male image of ploughing, the opening of earth with a sharp cutting tool, than on the image of a flower, the plant that naturally blossoms and bears fruit. This is the case with Marie de France in her general prologue and with Christine de Pisan. In the second network, the masculine forge, with its hammer striking the material, this second image is transformed into a feminine forge, that is, nature's kitchen. Nature makes men, says Christine, at the beginning of her Avision, like one makes waffles in Paris. The forge is also represented by maternity, the begetting of children in the womb. Finally, certain words seem to be favored by women to characterize their writing, words that usually sounds in men's mouth like reproaches against them. Passionate vehemence. They insist on the role of body, of emotion. The study highlights that the promotion of the authors and the French language go hand in hand. Both conquer their place on Latin. Women and the French language are fighting the same battle from indignity to affirmation. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. And the echoes between your two presentations, Martin Reed and the Jacqueline Touré, are actually striking because they both address the difficulty for women writers to reclaim and claim a space in the cultural field in the two different historical moments that each of you evoked. Alison, so this is now the turn of Alison Rice.
Hello and thank you. It's an honor to be here today with these illustrious colleagues and to represent, in a sense, francophonie. I myself am a francophone, not a native speaker of French by any means, as some people would describe it. However, I'm constantly hoping that we can expand our use of the term francophone, and that's partly what I do in my collaboration, in my contribution to this effort. It's something that I came to serendipitously due to a course that I took as a graduate student in French, and I will forever be indebted to Françoise Lyonnais, who was my instructor at the time, who is behind my falling in love with Francophone literature, and who has been a wonderful mentor to me. I am going to share my screen, and I am very mindful of time because I do hope that we'll have an opportunity to converse within this hour. So I will attempt to move very quickly through my slides here that I'm sharing. There's so much to say when it comes to francophonie, and when I was putting together my text for this volume, I was thinking about how to present francophonie in itself to a number of readers who might not be familiar with the concept, who might not know what it means to those of us who are scholars devoted to this across the Atlantic here in the United States. And it may take on very different meanings depending on the geographical location in which the specialists are located or the students, the readers themselves. So I thought today I might focus briefly on some interesting aspects of francophonie. Sometimes we don't know who the first writers were in various locations, and then some of the political aspects that are caught up in becoming published authors of French language literature. I begin by talking a bit in my text about the nomenclature itself. What does francophone mean? What has it meant over the years? The word francophone first appeared in print in 1886, but from that very moment, it was intended not to address or include native speakers, we might say, of French, or French speakers from France. And so the differentiation that was present from its inception is quite strong and has continued to create two separate categories over the years when the word francophone is employed. And in the publishing industry, in the literary landscape, that can take on derogatory possibilities for those who feel that they're separated from more legitimate, perhaps the words can vary, but writers of French who might be from the 6th arrondissement of Paris and therefore be perceived differently from writers who are from beyond the hexagon and sometimes far beyond. There are some women who have issued statements, who have written in very important ways, and we would be remiss if we didn't note that Assia Bar has some texts, essays that are published in Ces Voix qui m'assiègent, and in which she questions what the term francophonie means, and says that she places herself on the borders of this term. That it might be nice, as she suggests, to be considered simply a writer and not a woman and an Arab, which are two otherings, in a sense, that women writers of francophonie are constantly subjected to. Anna Moy came out with an essay several years later. This was published in 2006, a book-length essay, Esperanto Desesperanto, in which she laments the othering that is inherent in the term francophone or francophonie. Beyond birthplace is something that I'm quite keen to promote, in a sense. In my understanding of francophone, many writers are pinned down, in a sense, assigned a place, a category, a classification is made according to their place of birth. And many women writers whom we might consider francophone have various itineraries that are quite interesting. And it would be difficult to confine them to their place of birth as a sole identifying factor. So a broader understanding of francophonie in the plural that isn't overtly concerned with an author's place of origin would allow for a number of works to be appreciated in their multiplicity and complexity. And also dissociating the term perhaps from the colonial history with which it's been caught up from the very beginning, particularly as we move further away from that colonial history. We do want to remain mindful of it, aware of it, certainly not neglect it, but also not be assigning a francophone label to someone who is perceived to be from a colonial or post-colonial location, but rather opening it up in important ways is something that I'm exploring in this text. Very famous for many of us here in the United States and in the United Kingdom and other locations where francophone literatures are often studied. Pour une littérature monde was a movement of sorts. It can constitute a compelling call for different terminology, and it was initially a manifesto of sorts signed by 44 writers of various origins, including the former Nobel Prize winner, well, the Nobel Prize winning author, Luc Lézio, and many others. And it was nice that people who were assigned the label francophone and others who had not really as readily been assigned that label came together to sign a document that said that we should not necessarily consider writing in French to be tied to the nation, and wanted an alternative term to be applied that would be more inclusive and wide-ranging. I thought I might dive in just really quickly to some of the firsts that come from my title. Oft overlooked contributions are quite interesting when we look at the history of what we might call Francophone literature. We have figures who have not often been named, and many scholars of late have sought to bring to light their contributions to movements such as La Négritude. We know the famous three whose names are often mentioned, of course, Senghor, Césaire, Damas, but we have women who have been instrumental to these movements and who have not received credit. So we have Paulette Nardal, the first Black woman to attend the Sorbonne, also a writer and very important in journalistic efforts. Her sister Jane, also very influential, writing an essay titled Internationalisme Noir that addressed race consciousness among the African diaspora and cultural métissage. really writing, penning reflections that provided the philosophical foundation for the literary and cultural movement that developed in the 1930s under the neologism négritude. I have a section in my contribution titled "Figuring in the Photo," and I address this photo in particular that monumentalized the 1956 Congrès des Écrivains Noirs. Here, this photo is taken in the courtyard of the Sorbonne. There's one woman who is visible here, and she is the wife of Haitian Francophone author Jean Price Mars. But there were others who could have been there, many, including the wife of Alioune Diop, Christiane Yandé Diop, who had participated in the Négritude movement, first Black woman to serve at the head of a publishing house in Paris, which is the publishing house Présence Africaine, founded in 1947, the journal, and then the publishing house several years later. Suzanne Césaire is someone whom we can mention as having really participated, co-founding Tropique, and doing a number of other things. I mentioned the Missing Manuscript. She wrote a play that was quite important and interesting, and the manuscript itself was lost. And when her husband was questioned about why he didn't help her publish this work, he said, well, it's very hard for a woman to get published. And these comments, of course, carry through for decades to come, not just in the 1950s, but in the decades that have followed. It's been hard for a woman to get published, and a Francophone woman. Interestingly enough, there were ways of getting published initially when women did come to writing in places like Guadeloupe and Senegal. There were publishing houses in Africa that would allow them to be published a little more readily, perhaps, than if they had to go to Paris. Although Présence Africaine was present there as a possibility, and there were some others as well, of course. Simone Schwarz-Bart is one of the important firsts we might mention. Interestingly enough, she began co-authoring with her husband, André Schwarz-Bart, and really interesting works that they co-authored. This is her first single-authored text, Pluie et vent sur Télémée, Miracle, which came out in 1972. I realize that time is fleeting. I may just go through very quickly and just mention that a number of firsts are of great interest, and I could talk at length about the implications of their work. Here we have La Blanche Négresse, a second text published by the first Haitian woman writer to publish a novel, and then it finds sort of an echo in another text by Mayotte Capessia, not from Haiti, but from nearby Martinique, who is considered to be the first Black woman to publish a novel in France, who wrote La Négresse Blanche. So we have these two sort of echoing titles. This text was criticized by Frantz Fanon in a famous work of his for the racial dynamics of a sexual attraction of a dark-skinned woman to a white-skinned man, and these racial and really colonial ideas that are present are quite interesting and fraught. Just to touch briefly on the fakes idea, this is a woman writer, Elisa Raïs, who was touted as the first Algerian Francophone woman writer, and who later had an identity that was put into question as the author of a number of texts. And so, you know, the question of fakes is very big here. It was also the case of Mayotte Capessia that quite a bit later, people were, after these texts were published, people were putting into question the authenticity of the author. And I will just mention that there have been interesting collective feminist movements, many of which preceded the writing of individual authored novels. This is in Senegal, and feminist activism in New Caledonia, quite important for defending the rights of women in this location, and very aware of colonial domination, and then leading into, we might say, the publication of novels. Some more firsts. Recognition has been slow in coming for Francophone women writers, and I would say that there's perhaps been too quick an effort to recognize Francophone men, and once we think we have recognized a Francophone individual, we forget that there are also Francophone women. There are exceptions to that, and this is changing, but some of the large prizes, even within Francophonie or other areas, also anthologies, have not at all included women to the extent that they've included men. And this may be that there have been fewer women writers. We had a Prix Goncourt going to a male author as early as 1921 who would fit the title of Francophonie in its earliest sense. And many women weren't even beginning to write in the African continent and other locations until 50 years after. And in fact, in every part of the world, whether it's Vietnam or Canada, Quebec, women are beginning to write about 50 years, half a century after the first texts penned by male authors. Interestingly enough, though, if we look at the history of the Prix Féminin, the Prix Goncourt, these major literary awards, even the very first ones, which are represented here, represent diversity in such interesting ways. So when works are awarded, we find that this is Francophonie in a broad sense that is being recognized because it is so interesting. There are a number of singularities. This is Eun Ja-kong from South Korea, the first writer, male or female, to have published a Francophone or a French novel in France. Shumona Sinha is someone from India we might mention. We might think that she's really a first, but much to the contrary, Tora Dutt was one of the very first writers of Francophonie from Calcutta, as is Shumona Sinha, and this text was published way back in 1879, sorry. Finally, I'll mention just the great variety of Francophonies that are emerging, which are quite exciting. Yasmina Trabucha has a Lebanese father and a Brazilian mother, and so her texts move between those two countries and others. She's Parisian educated and has a London address and is writing in French in very interesting ways. I will stop there. I am so sorry for the time, and I thank you.
I believe that hello, Chris?
Yes,
Can you turn me on?
your video is on.
Yeah. So can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So it is my great pleasure to be here. And I, as my colleague Sylvain Guillot so elegantly spoke about the 2 volumes that have been published, I would just like to join her and speak my admiration for the organizers of these volumes, for the editors rather, and also for the contributors. These are 2 really essential volumes that will be with us for a very long time. It is my pleasure now to introduce the next 3 speakers. The first one is Christy Mcdonald. I could say that she needs no introduction, but I will also say nonetheless that she is the Smith Research Professor of French Language and Literature in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures and Research Professor of Comparative Literature at Harvard University. She's a specialist of the 18th century literature, a literary historian, a cultural critic and theorist. She is the author or editor of many books and articles in the areas of literature and philosophy, anthropology, feminist theory, and the arts, including music and painting. Co-editor with François Proulx of Proust and the Arts, with Stanley Hoffman, Rousseau and Freedom, and with Susan Suleiman, French Global, A New Approach to French Literary History, 2010, in French translation in 2014. She is also the author of The Extravagant Shepherd on Rousseau, Nouvelle Héloïse, The Dialogue of Writing on Rousseau and Diderot, Dispositions on Music and Text, and the Proustian Fabric, as well as the 18th century section in Femmes et Littérature, and her most recent publication is a new biography, Anne Eisner, an American artist, Life and Work Between Cultures, that was published in 2020. Our second speaker is Caleb Shelburne, an alumnus of the Kirkland House, I am proud to say, who is currently a graduate student in the History of Science department at Harvard, where he studies histories of technology and social theory in the Ottoman Empire. Caleb worked as a research assistant on the French Women Writers Project while an undergraduate at Harvard University. Our last speaker, Kylie Sago, recently defended her dissertation in the Department of Romance Languages and Literature at Harvard University. Her current research examines the entanglements of literature and empire, with a focus on the French Atlantic world in the 18th and 19th centuries. Her work can be found in the 19th century journal, in the journal 19th Century Context and the forthcoming volume, Encounters in the Arts, Literature and Philosophy, Chance and Choice, edited by Jérôme Briot and Virginie Green in the honor of Christy Mcdonald. She also assisted Andrew Saubenet in editing Revisioning French Culture, published by Liverpool University Press in 2019. Here is Christy Mcdonald.
Thank you very much, Verena. I'm going to talk briefly about the organization of the chapters, the sections in the 18th century chapters on women's writing. But first, I want to give you a sense of how the research was done. Over a 2-year period, I worked with a team of graduates and undergraduates, thanks in great part to the Summer Humanities and Arts Research Program, SHARP, created by then Dean of Humanities, Deanna Sorensen. It supported Ian Van Wy, Henry Schreffler, and Caleb Shelburne, all undergraduates at the time, to work respectively over 2 summers, gathering and analyzing material. Kylie Sago, Matt Barfield, and Sanam Nader Esfahani, all then graduate students in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures, participated as well. If ever there was, in my view, testimony to how collective projects can work in the humanities, it was this one for me. My thanks to a truly great team. I believe, as Martine was mentioning, that the time was right in France to do a comprehensive publication about women's writing in general. And it was for me particularly gratifying as a challenge to work on the 18th century. Starting in the late 1960s and 1970s with the second wave of feminism, research and writing on women's literature burgeoned, with scholars refinding and rediscovering the immense richness of women's writing in the 18th century, much, if not most of which, had been lost from view. Now there's a body of scholarly work with republished editions of women's writing and access online to works not yet republished. And I'll talk briefly at the end about a database we've made available of 18th century women's writing. The period from 1715 to 1793 in French literature and philosophy was a time of great change, as you know, when many of the principles leading to the French Revolution in 1789 were tested in novels, plays, treatises, essays, translations, with concerns about freedom, equality, and a new social contract. The beginning and end dates of our investigation were subject to debate. 1715 was obvious with the death of Louis XIV. 1793 ended constitutional monarchy as the year that King Louis XVI, Queen Marie-Antoinette, Jeanne Manon Roland, and Olympe de Gouges, among others, were all guillotined. I was interested to explore how women writers found ways to write within a systemically unequal social and political system, which I think are topics that are still very relevant today. Throughout the century, women writers took up uncertainties from multiple perspectives in the crossover of science, socio-political thought, philosophy, and literature, already postmodern in its diversity. Enlightenment may be defined and situated at a crossroads between critical reflection and reflection on history. It designates less a period that is finished than a continuing attitude, what Michel Foucault called a permanent critique of our historical era, as he reread Kant's definition of enlightenment. No one humanism dominates, but many humanisms, religious and secular, coexist. Women writers faced severe challenges in the 18th century as before, what Martine and Jacqueline already have spoken about. In the 18th century, charged arguments about how they could use their imagination, reason, and feeling with competing definitions of women as biologically or culturally determined creatures. The choice to write, to publish, and seek legitimacy in their writing involved resilience and determination, often working in what we call brave ways to be included in dialogue about the issues important to them. Women stepped into the light to take their place in the public sphere at their peril. Daring to know and to write involved a double jeopardy for women from which we can, I think, learn today. Writing first from within a hierarchy. As subjects, they were considered minors and later passive citizens. And also, they wrote in fiction and nonfiction about issues like gender equality and freedom, ethics, the sins of history, education, certainly, science and truth, and women as humans with rights. They established a dialogue with male writers and philosophers during this crucial time, Rousseau, Voltaire, Diderot, and the Encyclopédiste, for example. This literary and philosophical period for women of the Enlightenment is nevertheless fraught with contradiction and paradox, emerging aspirations and difficult constraints, as well as a desire to question authority, theological, political, and social authority, in writing about personhood, society, and tradition. Attitudes among these writers were not always of a whole piece. One could, for example, espouse an egalitarian view on education, but still believe that women should be relegated to motherhood and in marriage and the home. In the chapter, I'd identify what I call star figures, such as Du Châtelet, Graffigny, Gouges, Riccoboni, Charrière, and Stahl, among others, and they're studied in some detail. Many women writers were forgotten during the 19th century, but they were well known in their time. Barbier, Dacier, Gomez, Villeneuve, to name only a few. Many more appear in the chapter. The three major parts of the chapter are titled Liberté, Égalité, and Dilemme. Now, let's see if I can share. It's not working, my sharing. Bear with me for 1 second. Here we go. You can recognize the beginning of the national motto of France, which is in the singular, liberté, égalité, fraternité, and signals universal value. I made the section headings plural to distinguish the multiple struggles and perspectives of Enlightenment women writers within a society bound by dominant political and social structures in which they lived and worked. The section Liberté deals with the way in which women participated in the dialogue of enlightenment and how they negotiated traditions and expectations of the intellectual, social, and political roles they would play. Controverse deals with debates about the nature of women, debates about education and pedagogy. And after a certain point, for and against Rousseau, who was the elephant in the room on education. Réseau looks at the role of the salonière across the century and the notion of salon épistolaire, which deals with important correspondences that served then much as texting, email, even Zoom do now to bring people together. Women's participation in the competitions, the concours, is addressed by Académie, and Journalisme explores the pioneering role of women journalists and the journals they ran. Liberty and equality became a persistent negotiation as women writers adopted a plurality of ways to make their voices heard, juggling roles and values within culture. Women were not blind to the secret that cultural participation was also a political act. But for the most part, they set their eyes on the prize of writing as an intervention into ongoing dialogue with models and contemporaries. The second section deals with translation. Translation being a step into writing, from science to philosophy to literature, with some English mania in the mix, then rereading and rewriting, and finally, écrire pour le théâtre, women who wrote and produced plays, including the denunciation of slavery by Gouge and Stahl. The principle of universal equality was definitely an aspiration rather than a reality for women writers during this period. Yet more than merely struggle, and this is an image I'm particularly fond of, as glowworms, and Suzanne Necker, the mother of Germaine de Stael, as Necker charmingly described women, glowworms who were admired when dazzling in the shadows, but not in the light. Yet some women emerged as prodigies and others as strong voices, hardworking and successful, upon whom light deserved and still deserves to shine. The final section displaces the third term of the triptych, fraternity, into the title Dilemme, which probes the difficulties and conflicts women writers addressed in fictions with the newly invented genre or renovated genre, then in altérité, to think about otherness through literature and express rights, and finally to discuss the tactics women assumed to make their voices heard, addressing literary, philosophical, and social questions about marriage, family, and society. Tacking by definition took place for women writers within the bounds of this systemically uneven society. Its transformation from marriage and monarchy in the Ancien Régime to revolution gave women hope for greater freedom and equality by actively writing what they wanted to write and creating the worlds that reflected the dilemmas they faced. The Coda, Écrire pour l'ouvrier, deals with the necessity for women to tack and includes a discussion of one work beyond 1793, Charrière's Trois Femmes, which leaves unfinished answers to Enlightenment questions as an emblem of the status of both society and women at the time. Rather than structure this chapter chronologically with a premise of linear progress, the tripartite structure includes sections cutting across different genres and concerns, but within which each of which a roughly chronological development is followed. The reader will find that some of the most important writers appear in more than one section. There's also overlap in the questions that women writers addressed. How, for example, can one think about liberty without asking who enjoys freedom and without asking about or focusing on equality? Such overlaps lead to the dilemmas of competing values and goals for women writers. How to think also about reason and feeling or sentiment all at once. I came to conclude as a response to my initial question, which had been about what kind of agency women writers could gain. That agency is indeed at the center not only of literature, but of women's rights as human rights in a society whose values were undergoing massive changes. Dreams of equality were, if not dashed, far from realized by 1793. The unfinished issues of rights and demands that Enlightenment and then the Revolution had promised in principle, but did not in fact grant to all of society, is a legacy that is still being worked out more than 2 centuries later. In what ways, for example, through literature, culture, and politics, did women lay the basis for a new society to come? The vote, after all, was not gained in France until 1944. Focusing on the plurality within each major section, rather than on a universalist discourse of attained ideals, the subsections within each section deal with trends and the flow of time without being beholden to a rigid linear order of progress. And now I want to say about 2 words about the database created by Sanam Nader Esfahani, who could not be with us today. In doing this work, Sanam, who is now an assistant professor at Amherst, has made available online through Dataverse, which is at Harvard, and with the help of undergraduate Martha Denton, who, by the way, I understand is at Mather House, and support from Arts and Humanities Research Computing. You can download this Excel sheet with 400 searchable titles organized by title, author, or date. And it also indicates where books can be read on Gallica or Google Books or in the library. It is listed, just to give you the complete details here, in footnote 100 of the section Dilemme on page 942 in volume 1. So we invite you at every level to take our work on and deal with more and more and explore more and more of these women writers. Thank you very much.
Christy. And this is really fascinating what you're saying, and I will have some questions I'd like to come back with at the end. So in the meantime, we'd like to go on to our next speaker, who is Caleb Shelburne. Caleb, are you here?
I'm here. Sorry, my video is paused. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see that, Verena?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful. Okay, now hopefully you can see me as well. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to speak. Thank you, Christy, for all of your support over the many years. And thank you, Verena, for the kind introduction. It's truly an honor for me, a lowly graduate student, to be speaking among so many talented professors and colleagues. So today I thought I would talk about just one of the women covered in the section on 18th century French women writers to provide a little bit more of a deep dive rather than an overview. And this is very much informed by my more recent training in the history of the social sciences in my current department. So as soon as I joined this project as a research assistant, as a very ignorant research assistant, I learned that our time period was one in which what it meant to write was undergoing great change. New understandings of copyright, imagination, the public sphere, however you define it, the idea of authorship itself was transforming and coming into being in ways that we might recognize today. And authorship, of course, requires a certain kind of authority, particularly when writing nonfiction. What makes your ideas and arguments worthy of others' attention? 18th century women writers especially faced consistent obstacles to becoming a writer worth reading, some of them material, like access to booksellers and legal rights to publish, and others more abstract, like doubts about their analytical abilities and claims about their proper place in society. So accordingly, one of my questions, my research questions, was how did women writers justify the fact that they were writing, given that they had the desire to do so? Or more specifically, how did women writers claim authority in their writing? And of course, there's no single or easy answer to this question. As I think the book demonstrates very well, women adopted a variety of strategies with varying degrees of success. And by default, we only know about those who were in some manner successful. So today, I want to give you an example of one lesser known woman's efforts to defend her own authority in the nascent human sciences out of its own interest and to hopefully demonstrate the wide range of approaches women took to writing. So in 1766, a book appeared in Paris with a title that we might loosely translate as Reflections Ventured by an Ignorant Woman Who Knows the Faults of Others Only Through Her Own, and the World Only by Report and Hearsay. Now, at first glance, the title seems to claim exactly the opposite of authority. The author is ignorant, with only second-hand knowledge of the world. And indeed, one reviewer quipped that, quote, "There is nothing to add to this title," end quote, and asked the author why she expected readers to pick up the book at all. Now, to be more charitable, perhaps we should interpret this self-deprecation as a jibe at the conventions of the time, when false modesty was a ubiquitous rhetorical trope in introductions. On the other hand, the author's explicit gender suggests a more sobering interpretation. Is this the diffidence expected of any woman stating her mind? While there is certainly exaggeration here, which we may interpret as a critical reference to gendered norms of modesty, in the book itself, the author unexpectedly argues that this self-framing is not, in fact, a source of weakness, but instead of authority. Even ignorance does not preclude knowledge. Madame de Verzier, a member of a prominent Genoese banking family based in Paris at this time, begins her book with the rather astonishing claim that she was born with neither beauty nor esprit, which we might loosely translate as wit. Discovering that those around her resented these deficiencies in her character, she gradually withdrew from society, which only further exacerbated her, and I quote, "very great difficulty to express myself." But this self-isolation, while initially motivated by her pride, actually forced her to become introspective and gradually see her own faults, despite what she calls les lunettes de l'amour-propre, the glasses of self-love or ego. And over time, this careful study of herself inspired the reflective essays that form the chapters of this book on topics from the heart and the passions to marriage and education. And as you can see, this is just the beginning of the table of contents. There's really no discernible order to the reflections, and the genre is thus very difficult to determine, but I think it's loosely in moral philosophy and social critique. So how did she justify writing and publishing reflections on issues that ranged far beyond her personal experience, especially if she was so truly removed from society? Well, in a key passage in the preface, Verzier writes, "One cannot be more ignorant in all respects than I am, but it seemed to me that one may well not know anything and still feel, perceive, and even judge when one was drawing one's observations only from the motivations and weaknesses of the human heart. There is no method of study more certain, so it seems to me, than that which is indicated to us by our own sensations." In these few sentences, she turns her own ignorance, as referenced in the title, into the basis for her authority. Too much prior knowledge might even limit one's ability to understand oneself. For Verzier, feelings and perceptions are the most important basis for making judgments about the world. Now, this argument reappears throughout the book, perhaps most notably in the reflection titled "On the Power of the Senses over Reason." She gives the example, without specifying a name, of an elderly man, venerated for his wisdom and reason, who, in a fit of passion, falls for and marries a 15-year-old girl, ruining his reputation. Now, this is a character we all can recognize, she explains, and we might still recognize it today. And it should teach us that no matter how rational we may seem, we are always, quote, "fragile and weak in the face of our own desires." She then gives several more examples of both men and women with this rational reputation who end up foregoing their expected behavior in a dramatic upsurge of feeling. With this in mind, she claims that we can only maintain our virtue through carefully controlling our passions. But this is not achieved through abstract reasoning about morality, but through a thorough and even distressing knowledge and study of our own faults. Now, you may recognize in this analysis one of the major debates in the emergent human sciences of the 18th century, the debate between what we might call moral and physical history. Are our thoughts and actions guided by our moral reasoning or our physical sensations and drives? And often the key question was when, not if, humans moved to social and moral being from a more natural prehistory. Well, Verzier clearly falls on the latter side, the side of physical history, and emphasizes that this applies to all people, both men and women, which is an important point since many believe that women were far more subject to their animal desires, while men were more able to overcome them. Now, it would be interesting, and I think worthwhile, for someone to analyze Verzier's thought in greater detail in the context of that debate, but for now I want to argue that this stance provides a philosophical basis for her own authorship. So to what extent does gender matter to this philosophical stance? In the dedication to the book, to the Marquis de Mirabeau, this is the father of the famous revolutionary figure, Verzier offers an explanation of her decision to remain anonymous and a hint at her title. She claims that while wanting to deliver the book in person to Mirabeau out of respect, she says, quote, "A woman who decides to write and who dares to hazard a publication," and that's a literal translation of hasarder, "must conceal herself with care and guard herself from ever being recognized." The verb hasarder, used also in the title, indicates the riskiness of this endeavor. She is certainly modest, she's certainly venturing forth thoughts, but there is also an element of bravery and boldness in publishing these reflections. In this case, in the sentence explicitly linked to her gender. She also invokes a very real hazard of writing as a woman, the risk of personal scandal. Men could be ostracized for books, deemed immoral or uninformed, but women faced far more daunting consequences. One need only think of the famous Madame de Lambert, who despite her social standing, or rather because of it, bought back the majority of copies of an unauthorized publication of one of her works, considering it a great dishonor. For those women who did publish works of nonfiction, perhaps the most common criticism was a lack of knowledge and originality, that the work was derivative or even ghostwritten by a male author, as several of our speakers have already referenced. But I think Verzier, in effect, forestalls such critiques by accepting and even advertising her ignorance and writing instead from her own sensations. Though as we saw in the review quoted before, this does not seem to have been a persuasive tactic for some readers. But even with that framing, she considers anonymity a necessary tool to protect herself. So in conclusion, I hope you will remember Madame de Verzier's Reflections Ventured by an Ignorant Woman as a reminder of the range of experiences and styles taken up by 18th century French women writers. While undoubtedly a member of the elite, she is a self-described social recluse, far from the familiar archetype of the glamorous salonière. To modern eyes, her claims to write from her interiority, to analyze and explain based on her own feelings may seem rather trite, but for its time, I think there is a revolutionary element here. Verzier has cast off the usual standards by which authority was judged, education, genius, and even those qualities associated with women, like beauty and social wit. Instead, she claims that careful study of the sensations, even without traditional book learning, can make a book of social reflections worthwhile. In other words, she has found meaning and motivation within her own heart, and that, I think, makes a woman writer worth celebrating. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caleb, for this really great presentation, and that is also joins a lot of contemporary debates. Now, somebody should tell me how I turn off and on my, that rejoins a lot of contemporary debates, and I hope we get to discuss that during our question and answer period. Right now, our last speaker is Kylie Sago. So Kylie, I'm turning this over to you.
Thank you very much. In the chat, I am putting a link to the rough transcript of what I'll be saying today, if anybody would like to follow along. I will be trying to abbreviate my remarks in order to give us as much time as possible for discussion afterwards. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm truly delighted to be celebrating the publication of Femmes et Littérature with all of you. And I am so pleased to have had the opportunity to work with the research team led by Christy Mcdonald on 18th century French women writers. Today, I'll be speaking about two French women writers who penned the first versions of the Beauty and the Beast fairy tale in the 18th century. Gabrielle Suzanne de Villeneuve and Jean-Marie Le Prince de Bomo. And I will show how their texts reflect the global reaches of the French Empire, as well as depict social dynamics of the Atlantic world. Relatively little is known about Villeneuve's biography. We know that she had a relationship with Crébillon Père, the poet, playwright, and royal censor. And before her death in 1755, Villeneuve published 2 collections of tales, a novella, and 4 novels. The Young American Woman and the Sea Tales was published in 2 volumes in 1740 and 41. The Sea Tales were not Villeneuve's greatest commercial success, but they were popular within her lifetime. And it is this work for which Villeneuve is best known today because it includes the first version of the Beauty and the Beast fairy tale. The Sea Tales are told to pass the time during a weeks-long journey from France to Saint-Domingue, or modern-day Haiti. The young American woman of the title, a girl of about 13 years old, is returning home to her family after having spent a decade in France for her education. She's accompanied by a beloved maid, her fiancé, and a female relative. After 2 weeks at sea, the girl is desperately bored and asks the maid for a story, and the captain overhears them, which prompts great embarrassment among the girl's relative and her fiancé, that she would be interested in such juvenile amusements. But the captain quells these anxieties about the status of stories by asking the maid to share them more publicly with other passengers and with the ship's crew. And just as the maid begins to tell the story, the text directly addresses the reader with an invitation to imagine ourselves aboard this ship as well. The maid's version of Beauty and the Beast is hardly recognizable to audiences today who are more familiar with film versions like those by Jean Cocteau or Disney. And the length, complexity, and violence of the story corresponds to the fact that it was addressed to a group of adults. And rather than go through the plot of the story, what I just want to emphasize is the violence. Specifically, Beauty fears that she's going to be killed. Either she'll fall victim to the beast's sexual appetite, as every day he asks the question, "Do you want me to sleep with you?" Or she also fears that she might be eaten. And the story is textually incredibly complex. There are nested stories within stories, and this has led scholars to describe the Sea Tales as a Baroque or a grotesque text. But what I really want to emphasize is the centrality of marriage to this theme, as a theme to this fairy tale. The whole story centers around whether or not Beauty can stomach marriage with the beast in light of the violence that she fears, and she experiences pressure from her father to do so in light of the beast's wealth. And so scholars primarily to this point have analyzed how the tale speaks to the young woman's experience of sexuality and desire, as well as how the story depicts a historically very real possibility that a young woman might find herself betrothed to an abominable person. And the larger text of the Sea Tales shows that Villeneuve is specifically concerned with marriage in the context of the French Atlantic world. Elsewhere, I have analyzed the markers of the French Empire, which are present within the text itself, the fairy tale itself, which range from cups of hot chocolate to the depiction of enslaved workers. But here I will focus on colonial marriages present in the Sea Tales. For before the maid begins to tell Beauty and the Beast, Villeneuve's text depicts 3 other marriages in the young American woman's family, as well as her own engagement. We have the young woman's father, who delayed his marriage. He was an impoverished nobleman in Picardy, and he delays marriage in order to try to make his fortune in the colonies, where in Saint-Domingue, he marries the daughter of a plantation owner. And his sage financial decisions contrast starkly with the story of his closest friend, who in marrying rashly only for love, without regard to finances, mires his family in a catastrophic debt. And Villeneuve's fairy tale critiques the merchant who is willing to marry off his daughter to a literal monster. But the sea tales themselves show in the story of the young American woman's engagement, it offers a concrete model for families who are hoping to make colonial marriages seem as personally appealing to the parties involved as they would have been financially beneficial. And the text, for instance, recounts how the young American woman's family builds positive anticipation of the marriage and shields the girl from forming attachments with other potential suitors. And although Villeneuve's text provides multiple models and counter models for colonial marriages, her sea tales do not indicate how the listeners, the listening public of Beauty and the Beast, reacted to the resonances of the fairy tale with their own lives. Because there were 2 volumes of the sea tales that were published with plans for a third, but the third volume never appeared. So the transatlantic voyage breaks off partway before the engaged couple arrives in Saint-Domingue. But the next adaptation of this fairy tale by a French woman writer, Jeanne-Marie Le Prince de Beaumont in 1756, leaves no doubt as to the specific pertinence of Beauty and the Beast to readers in the Atlantic world. With Le Prince de Beaumont, I'll just speak very briefly to the fact that Le Prince de Beaumont published 7 pedagogical magazines in her life, which were each tailored to the different age, genders, and social statuses of readers. And here I'm focusing on the 1756 Young Mrs. magazine, which included what would become the most popular version of Beauty and the Beast. It is interesting, so there are many different genres of text that are included in Le Prince de Beaumont's magazines. They range from historical texts to lessons of geography to Bible stories. And the status of fairy tales within these texts themselves is quite ambiguous which reflects Le Prince de Beaumont's negative opinion about the stories. She cautioned that fairy tales were inappropriate for children, citing specifically their ridiculous, marvelous style and their moral ambiguities. And in the preface to the Young Mrs. magazine, Le Prince de Beaumont indicates that I attentively reread 12 volumes of fairy tales. I did not find a single one that I could fashion to my liking. And so it's somewhat surprising that we find Beauty and the Beast and Villeneuve uncited in Le Prince de Beaumont's pedagogical magazine. Here, the story is much simplified. It is less violent, and its potential morals are limited to prioritizing inner qualities of character over a person's outer appearance. And so the governess tells the fairy tale of Beauty and the Beast to a group of young English girls. And afterwards, the girls discuss whether in Belle's place they could have married the Beast. And their conversation remains focused on marriage until Miss Molly, a girl of 7 years old, chimes in to relate Belle's experiences to the Beast to her own experiences with a black footman in her father's household. So in so doing, Le Prince de Beaumont inscribes a racial reading of Beauty and the Beast into the text of the Young Mrs. magazine itself. And the governess confirms Miss Molly's racial reading of the fairy tale, even as she steers the girls' discussion back to marriage. And in so doing, the governess says that the lessons of the tale are not only applicable for women who are looking to tolerate a disappointing match, but they can also be harnessed for young women to dissimulate their own appearance by attracting focus to the goodness of their character in order to themselves secure a more advantageous or desirable partner. And in this discussion between the governess and the girls after the story, we see the wide applicability of the fairy tale to young white women who are navigating their relative power in imperial contexts. Beauty and the Beast is applicable for girls who are contemplating marriage, but also within other relationships in their domestic household, including with servants. So in conclusion, I would just like to evoke that both Villeneuve and Le Prince de Beaumont are very concerned with how fairy tales are perceived, who is their intended audience, and what social purpose they might serve. And even as Villeneuve valorizes fairy tales as pastimes, her text offers extensive commentary on marriage in the 18th century Atlantic world. Le Prince de Beaumont, however, we saw is quite distrustful of fairy tales, and this distrust is founded on the anxiety around the uncontrolled nature of their interpretations, which the pedagogue worries runs counter to the education of children in particular. And I think it is precisely this flexible interpretation that renders Beauty and the Beast such an enduring text. There is something of a timeless appeal to the fairy tale. But my project in researching 18th century French women writers is to emphasize not the timelessness, but the timeliness of these stories. That is how Villeneuve and Le Prince de Beaumont are clearly engaging in and responding to a globalized 18th century world through their fairy tales. Their texts explore how colonialism permeates the lives of Europeans, regardless of where they find themselves in the French Empire. They depict colonial wealth. They recognize that wealth's origins in the triangular trade and the enslaved labor on which the plantation economy relied. And they show how transatlantic voyages change how marriages are arranged. So researching Beauty and the Beast entails understanding not only how these texts reflect globalized colonial contexts for contemporary readers, but the fairy tales themselves were offered as guides to that world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kylie. This is certainly a paper that will make us reread and rewatch The Beauty and the Beast in a very different way. Thank you for your contribution. And we do have a few minutes now to open up our discussion to questions. I would like to say that there is a question, a recurring question about the social class and the women that several people have asked. All the women who seem to be writing from the Middle Ages on to the 18th century seem to belong to more educated spheres in the society. And I wonder if you would like to answer that and also see whether you perceive a difference between then and today. It's an open question to anybody. I mean, it was originally asked of Jacqueline Sergini, Tule. Jacqueline, whether the women in the Middle Ages belonged to a higher social class and whether things were that different today, and whether also the remuneration of women was always different from that of men. So I don't know where you are, Jacqueline. You're not on my screen yet.
Merci pour cette question.
Somebody could tell me how to deal with the spotlight because I don't seem to be able to handle it.
So what you're going to do is just go to the top right hand corner of your screen and put it into where it says view, put it into gallery view. You should be able to see everybody.
Oh, the view. Okay, very good. Thank you. Wonderful. No, that didn't work. Didn't work at all. Curious, I think I need your help.
Jacqueline, do you want to answer the question while we try to figure that out?
Jacqueline, à vous.
Oui, alors,
You have to unmute yourself.
le son est remis, c'est ça?
Yeah.
Bon.
Bon, la question sur le statut social des écrivains, je réponds en français, hein, le statut social des écrivains, des écrivaines au Moyen-Âge est compliqué. Pour écrire, on ne va pas gagner de l'argent de sa production littéraire. La première qui vit, comme on dit, de sa plume, c'est Christine de Pisan. Mais pour cela, la condition a été qu'elle soit veuve, d'une part, et qu'elle décide dans un acte volontaire et très vigoureux de ne pas se remarier. Donc, toutes les autres sont des religieuses, donc des gens dont le statut social va dépendre de leur fonction à l'intérieur de l'Église. Alors, on voit apparaître à la fin du Moyen-Âge, malgré tout, des femmes, non pas des femmes auteurs, alors celles qui peuvent écrire de la littérature de cours, donc c'est des œuvres très brèves, sont par exemple la dernière femme de Charles d'Orléans, mais c'est un rondeau ou deux, c'est très peu. Autrement, on voit des femmes qui rentrent dans les professions qui entourent l'écriture, c'est-à-dire qui peuvent être des libraires, des femmes qui vendent des livres, des femmes qui mettent ces livres en circulation. Donc ça, c'est assez intéressant de le voir. Elles le font, c'est toujours dans la dépendance des hommes, d'abord parce qu'elles sont la femme de libraire, et ensuite, quand le mari meurt, parce qu'elles arrivent à reprendre la succession, ce qui est assez compliqué juridiquement, mais elles le font. Donc c'est quelque chose d'assez intéressant de voir que c'est une condition dépendante malgré tout. Et là, l'originalité de Christine de Pisan est absolument extraordinaire.
L'homme à ses côtés, that's also something that even Simone de Beauvoir, mentions as very dear to her. And there was a question that actually wondered whether you, Caleb, in particular, spoke about the beginning of some rational pragmatism, the kind that was invoked by Simone de Beauvoir through your study of your author.
Sure. Well,
actually, I had that was not my question, but I had a personal interest in that because even when I was growing up and going to school en Suisse, les femmes belles n'étaient pas censées produire, n'est-ce pas? C'était l'intellect ou la beauté, mais jamais les deux. C'est très souvent les deux, parce que quand on est photogénique, ça va très bien, n'est-ce pas? Alors, et je pensais aussi, I was also thinking, so please answer that question if you can. It was a question in the chat. But I also was thinking that the woman hadn't read her Spinoza of the 17th century, which would have helped her greatly overcome her dualism.
Thank you. I think it's very difficult for me, from my vantage, to position her within any kind of philosophical tradition among women writers. I think that's just a fraught historical enterprise. And I think that it's interesting because there is a strong cliche of women writers in the 18th century writing specifically from their emotions and their sensations. And in some sense, Madame de Verzier is leaning into that or emphasizing it more than some of the other authors. So I'm not sure that I would describe this as a kind of rational pragmatism, but I don't have a great answer to that. As for the beauty and wit thing, I think that comes down to her topics. Her favorite topic is the social elite, the salons of Paris. And I think that the significance of her beauty and her wit is that these are important traits to participate in those spaces. And so they sort of mark her position relative to them, and thus the stance from which she can reflect on them. So I'm not sure how much they're directly related to her ability to produce writing as much as to the specific topics and the relationships that she's describing. But it is an interesting question to think more about.
There's so many different questions, and I'm looking for one that would really appeal to everyone here. In your when you were writing your contributions, did you come across? Did you have to ask yourself the question on whether you were dealing with difficult material, with matière épineuse, that you probably had to take special care, and not in the sense in which Martine Reed said that women were supposed to take care of things, but you had to take special care in order to deal with these questions épineuses. C'est une question ouverte, donc. Yes, Alison.
Yes, I'd be happy to answer this just briefly to say that I think the very question of francophonie and some of its connotations that I mentioned as I was speaking, its connections to colonialism, often there are racial implications, suppositions regarding ethnicity that are caught up in the francophone designation. And there are some women writers from elsewhere, if we want to refer to them as that, who might be from Eastern Europe or from Canada, who are immediately referred to as French writers, and others who are from former French colonies, but entirely different locations as well, who are immediately classified as francophone. And there are series that exist, such as Continent Noir, the very title of which is rather striking, a series at Gallimard, that sort of stands out in contrast to the Collection Blanche, if we look at those titles. And dealing with that, was something for a work that would be published at Gallimard, something that I felt was a sensitive, delicate issue that went along with the larger question, perhaps, of what to include and what not to include, which is precisely so difficult when you feel that you're limited space-wise in providing a narrative and not just an anthology, an anthological listing of names and places. So how to make sense of it all, how to place it in context, and how to be sensitive to some of these larger questions, which are really heavy issues, and not to just gloss over them too quickly, were some of the challenges I've faced. Thank you.
Are there other challenges? I bet, Alison, you also you had the additional challenge of why writers chose to write in French rather than in a different language, for example. So that really makes your classification very unstable and very difficult to do. Are there other people? If not, we have a question. I have a question for Kylie about your use of colonialism. And so colonialism really is kind of considered as an expansion on the world. And where does a woman position herself in relation to this colonialism? I think you spoke about it a little bit, perhaps, but it was apparently would like a little bit more, a few more details.
Yes, thank you so much. I think
it's just to qualify that a little more. It's a male thing. It's the male thing. It's the expansionism through colonialism. And so, where does a woman position herself in relation to that?
Right. Yes, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think that these fairy tales show us that the important role, women negotiating their role within empire. They're negotiating their places within the relative hierarchies of gender and race. We see that especially with Le Prince de Beaumont's version of the Beauty and the Beast fairy tale, in which this 7-year-old girl creates a racial reading of the story and seeks to find a way for the story to apply to the different situations in which she's going to find herself in her life. And so I think that it's important for us to continue working on questions like this, especially with these texts that became so popular within their times, because it will help us see how, I think it will help us understand the role of white women within the empire, and to see that, to see how they consider themselves to be imperial agents, even if they never left the metropolitan territory.
Thank you. Indeed. I mean, there's so many questions that are being raised. Do we have time for more? Who's the timekeeper? Chris, do we have time for another question? One more? Yes. So, I mean, Christy, this question is for you. You spoke about the attitudes and how they were not all of one piece, and there was a question about the Déclaration des droits de l'homme, and that excludes the femmes, the women excluded from that, was the traditional question, and so if you'd like to position yourself next to that, but also I would like to add to this. Last night at the Black Lives Matter conference that I attended, the Claudia Rankins, the poet, was talking about how the Declaration of Independence didn't recognize any people of color at all and not as slaves. So how would you put the droit de l'homme, the Declaration des droits de l'homme, next to the other, since in one the women are included, in the others they're excluded? You're muted.
I said, and we'll say again, that's a wonderful question, very important question. To the question of women writers not being of totally coherent with themselves or of one piece, there's a lot of debate where there's difference, but very often women writers believed in the question of education, that was one rallying point, that everyone would say, if you can educate women, you can understand that women can be knowledgeable, that they can write, that they can have agency. And so that goes throughout the century. And by the time you get much later on to the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and Gouge writes her own Declaration of the Rights of Women and Citizens, she adds women to it to show that the Declaration of Rights of Man, in its first iteration, and the iteration that really came down through the centuries, was one which proposed equal rights, but in fact did not include everyone, including women in this case. And so I think that apparently her declaration was only, sent around to about 5 or 10 people. So not very many people read it, but it's extremely important that she actually wrote this down to include women in every single article. And I think speaks today to the question of what, in not just each national history, but across time, the rights, equal rights are, and how not only do you have to write them in a sense, but you have to act upon them. And I think we're going to be out of time probably.
Yeah. But I mean, thank you so much. And let me just say that thank you so much to the panelists. This was a wonderful, provocative panel. And I think we're all going to go home and read more. And we realize that a lot has been done for women, and a lot remains to be done. And certainly all of you contributed to furthering the path of women, and thank you so very much. So Christy, would you perhaps like to make a few concluding remarks?
I don't have any concluding remarks to make other than to thank everyone on this panel. Thank you so much for being present virtually with us today. It's wonderful to hear you and to see you, of course. And we hope that, that the book will be carried on by other people who will continue the work that we've started. And also a thank you to the other contributors who aren't here today, and very much to Martine who began this whole project. So and to the audience. So thanks to all.
Thank you. Okay, how do I do this? Okay.
Okay, so I removed all of the attendees, so it's just us left, but it looks like Christy left, so I didn't know if there's anything else that you want to discuss before we break. I can send you all the recording when it's available.
Okay, yeah, I didn't know how that was working.
It looked like you were also recording it to your own computer.
I saw it said it was recording, but I didn't start, so I don't know if it was recording in my computer.
It looked like Verena and you were also recording it to your computers, but I was recording it to the cloud, so I can send you send you all a copy of that when it's available. It'll take a little while to be available.
Okay.
But I think it went well. What is your feeling?
Yeah,
I think
that was good.
I think it went pretty smoothly, and really authentic when people have little issues, I mean, very, I think it went really well. Chris, thank you.
Okay.
This was like a big deal for I'm not really doing this stuff. So it's like, wow, trying to fit everybody together and get them to come in when they need to come in. And, it's challenging.
Yeah, there was just a few times I had to mute people